I am Dr. Subhasree, Assistant Professor, PG and Research Department of History, Sri Sharda College for Women, Salem 16. Today we are going to see the topic First Opium War 1839 to 1842. Introduction. The Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860 marked a new stage in China's relations with the West. China's military defeats in these wars forced its rulers to sign treaties opening many ports to foreign trade. The restrictions imposed under the Canton system was abolished. Opium, despite imperial prohibitions, now became a regular item of trade. As opium flooded into China, its price dropped, local consumption increased rapidly, and the drug penetrated all levels of society in the new treaty ports. Foreign traders collaborated with a greater variety of Chinese merchants than under the Canton system, and they ventured deeply into the Chinese interior. Missionaries brought Christian teachings to villages protected by the diplomatic rights obtained under the treaties. Popular hostility to the new foreigners began to rise. Not surprisingly, Chinese historians have regarded the two opium wars as unjust and impositions of foreign power on the weakened Qing Empire. In the 20th century, the Republic of China made strenuous efforts to abolish what it called unequal treaties. It succeeded in removing most of them in World War II, but this phase of foreign imperialism only ended completely with the reversion of Hong Kong to China in 1997. Conventional textbooks even date the beginning of modern Chinese history from the end of the First Opium War in 1842. Although the war's opium trade and treaties did reflect superior Western military force, focusingly only on Western impositions on China gives us too narrow a picture of this period. This was not only a time of Western and Chinese conflict over trade, but a time of great global transformation in which China played one important role. The traders in opium included Britain, the US, Turkey, India, and Southeast Asia, as well as domestic Chinese merchants. The origins of opium consumption in China are very old, and its first real boom as an item of consumption began after tobacco was introduced from the New World in the 16th century, and Chinese smokers took a fancy to mixing it with the drug. The Qing court was not in principle hostile to useful trade. In 1689 and 1727, the court had negotiated treaties with Russia to exchange furs from Siberia for tea and allowed the Russians to live in a foreigner's guest house in Beijing. Qing merchants and officials also traded extensively with Central Eurasian merchants from Bukhara and the Kazakh nomads for vital supplies of wool, horses, and meat. The court knew well the value of the southern coastal trade as well, since revenues from the Canton trade went directly into the imperial household department. Opium was rightly named. It was not trade per se, but rather unrestricted drug trade by the Western powers, particularly Britain, that precipitated them. As the wars unfolded, however, it became clear that far more than opium was ultimately involved. The very nature of China's hitherto aloof relationship with the world was profoundly challenged, and long decades of internal upheaval lay ahead. Tensions under the Canton trade system. Under the system established by the Qing dynasty to regulate trade in the 18th century, Western traders were restricted to concluding trade through the southern port of Canton. They could only reside in the city in a limited space, including their warehouses. They could not bring their families, and they could not stay there for more a few months of the year. Qing officials closely supervised trading relations, allowing only licensed merchants from Western countries to trade through a monopoly guild of Chinese merchants called the Kohong. Western merchants could not contact Qing officials directly, and there were no formal diplomatic relations between China and Western countries. The Qing emperor regarded trade as a form of tribute or gifts given to him personally by envoys who expressed gratitude for his benevolent rule. Western traders, for their part, mainly conducted trade through licensed monopoly companies like Britain's East India Company and the Dutch VOC. Despite these restrictions, both sides learned how to make profits by cooperating with each other. The Chinese Hong merchants, the key intermediaries between the foreign traders and the officials, developed a close relationship with their Western counterparts, instructing them on how to conduct their business without antagonizing the Chinese bureaucracy. As the volume of a trade grew, however, the British demanded greater access to China's markets. Tea exports from China grew from 92,000 pounds in 1700 to 2.7 million pounds in 1751. By 1800, the East India Company was buying 23 million pounds of tea per year at a cost of 3.6 million pounds of silver. Concerned that the China trade was draining silver out of England, the British searched for a counterpart commodity to trade for tea and porcelain. They found it in opium, which they planted in large quantities after they had taken Bengal in India in 1757. British merchants blamed the restrictions of the Canton trade for the failure to export enough goods to China to balance their imports of tea and porcelain. Thus, Lord George Macartney's mission to the court in Beijing in 1793 aimed to promote British trade by creating direct ties between the British government and the emperor. Macartney, however, portrayed his embassy as a tribute mission to celebrate the emperor's birthday. He had only one man with him who could speak Chinese. When he tried to raise the trade question after following the tribute rituals, Macartney's demands were rejected. His gifts of astronomical instruments intended to impress the Qing Emperor with British technological skills in fact did not look very impressive. The Emperor had already received similar items from Jesuits in earlier decades. Macartney's failure and the failure of a later mission, the Amherst Embassy, in 1816 helped to convince the British that only force would induce the Qing government to open China's ports. New fast sailing vessels called clipper ships, built with narrow decks, large sail areas and multiple masts, first appeared in the Pacific in the 1830s and greatly stimulated the trade. They carried less cargo than the bulky East Indiamen but could bring fresh teas to Western markets much faster. Clipper ships also proved very convenient for the smuggling opium and were openly and popularly identified as opium clippers. Ships like the Red Rover could bring opium quickly from Calcutta to Canton, doubling their owners' profits and by making 2 voyages a year. At Canton, Qing prohibitions had forced the merchants to withdraw from Macao and Wampu and retreat to Linton Island at the entrance of the Pearl River beyond the jurisdiction of local officials. There, the merchants received opium shipments from India and handed the chest over to small Chinese junks and rowboats called fast crabs and scrambling dragons to be distributed to small harbors along the coast. The later local smuggling boats were sometimes propelled by as many as 20 or more oars on each side. Major India source of British opium bound for China was Patna in Bengal, where the drug was processed and packed into chests holding about 140 pounds. The annual flow to China was around 4,000 chests by 1790 and a little more than double this by the early 1820s. Imports began to increase rapidly in the 1830s, and however, as free trade agitation gained strength in Britain and the East India Company's monopoly over the China trade approached its termination date in 1834, the company became more dependent than ever on opium revenue, while private merchants hastened to increase their stake in the lucrative trade. On the eve of the First Opium War, the British were shipping some 40,000 chests to China annually. By this date, it was estimated that there were probably around 10 million opium smokers in China. 2 million of them were addicts. American merchants shipped around 10,000 chests between 1800 to 1839. Mandarins, merchants and missionaries. The opium trade was so vast and profitable that all kinds of people, Chinese and foreigners, wanted to participate in it. Wealthy literary and merchants were joined by people of lower classes who would now afford cheaper versions of the drug. Hong merchants cooperated with foreign traders to smuggle opium when they could get away with it, bribing local officials look the other way. Smugglers, peddlers, secret societies, and even banks in certain areas all became complicit in the drug trade. Opium, as an illegal commodity, brought in no customs revenue, so local officials exacted fees from merchants. Even missionaries who deplored the opium trade on moral grounds commonly found themselves drawn into it or dependent on it in one form or another. They relied on the opium clippers for transportation and communication, for example, and used merchants dealing in opium as their bankers and money changers. Karl Gitzlaff, a Protestant missionary from Pomerania, who was exceptionally exceptionally gifted linguist and gained a modicum of both fame and notoriety by becoming closely associated with the opium trade and then serving the British in the Opium War, not just as an interpreter but also an administrator in areas occupied by the foreign forces. The Dao Guang Emperor and Commissioner Lin. By the 1830s, up to the 20% of central government officials, 30% of local officials, and 30% of low level officials regularly consumed opium. The Dao Guang Emperor himself was an addict and were most of his court. As opium infected the Qing military forces, the court grew alarmed at its insidious effects on national defense. Opium imports also appeared to be the cause of massive outflows of silver, which destabilized the currency. While the court repeatedly issued edicts demanding punishments of opium dealers, local officials accepted heavy bribes to ignore them. In 1838, one opium dealer was strangled at Macao and 8 chests of opium were seized in Canton. Still, the emperor had not yet resolved to take truly decisive measures. As opium flooded the country despite imperial prohibitions, the court debated its response. On one side, officials concerned about the economic cost of the silver drain and the social cost of addiction argued for stricter prohibitions aimed not only at Chinese consumers and dealers but also at the foreign importers. On the other side, a mercantile interest, including southern coastal officials allied with local traders, promoted legalization and taxation of the drug. Debate dragged within court circles in the early 1800s as factions lined up patterns and pushed their favorite policies. Ultimately, Ultimately, the Dao Guang Emperor decided to support hardliners who called for complete prohibition, sending the influential official Lin Zexu to Canton in 1839. Lin was a morally upright, energetic official who detested the corruption and the decadence created by the opium trade. He had served in many important provincial posts around the empire and gained a reputation for impartiality and dedication to the welfare of the people he governed. In July 1838, he sent a memorial to the emperor supporting drastic measures to suppress opium use. He outlined a systematic policy to destroy the sources and equipment supporting drug use and began putting this policy into effect in provinces of Hubei and Hunan. After 19 audiences with the emperor, he was appointed imperial commissioner with full powers to end the opium trade in Canton. He arrived in Canton in March 1839. Although Lin's vigorous attempt to suppress the opium trade ultimately ended in disastrous war and personal disgrace, he is remembered a great and incorruptible patriot, eminently deserving of the nickname he had enjoyed before his appointment as an imperial commissioner in Canton, Lin the Blue Sky. Portraits of him by Chinese artists at the time vary in style, but all convey the impression of a man of wisdom and integrity. Today, statues in and even outside China pay homage to the redoubtable commissioner. Production and consumption. As the court in China debated opium prohibition, East India Company developed opium production as an enormous scale in India. The company established its main production center in Patna, a town in Bihar, 600 kilometers up to the Ganges River from Calcutta. There they forced Indian laborers to work in the extensive poppy fields and prepare the opium in large mixing rooms and examining halls. A skilled workman was required to produce at least 100 balls of opium per day. Then the balls were staked to be packed in chests made of timber from Nepal. From Patna, a fleet of native boats took the product down the Ganges River to Calcutta. Two very different runs of graphics produced by eyewitnesses in the 1850s convey a vivid sense of the production process that was followed throughout most of the 19th century. The first is a spectacular suite of lithographs based on drawings by Walter S. Shervill, a lieutenant colonel who served as a British boundary commissioner in Bengal. The second rendering of different stages of opium manufacture consists of 19 paintings on mica by the Indian artist Shiva Lal, commissioned by Dr. D.R. Lyall, the East India Company's personal assistant in charge of opium making. Lal's work was terminated when Lyall was killed in the 1857 Indian Mutiny. Opium consumption. Opium is a product of the opium poppy Papaver somniferum, which grows widely across the Middle East, India, and Southeast and East Asia. Chinese had known it mainly as a medicinal herb for many centuries. In the 16th century, it appeared in a new form mixed with a new drug from the New World, tobacco. Along with maize, sweet potatoes, chili peppers, and peanuts, tobacco was one of the crops brought to China by the Spanish and Portuguese. These crops flourished in the hill country of South China in places where it was difficult to grow rice. The Chinese quickly developed a craving for tobacco, although, as in England, critics attacked it for its addictive and wasteful qualities. Although opium was a familiar product in China, by the 18th century, consumers looked for stronger stuff. During the 18th century, consumption of tropical, addictive, and alcoholic products increased throughout the world. Traders and producers found ways to make these seductive products cheaper, stronger, and more widely available. Vodka consumption in Russia, for example, more than doubled, becoming a cheap source of intoxication, and elites campaigned against it as a moral threat to national life. Americans, for their part, brewed large quantities of fermented apple cider. Tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, sugar, alcohol, and opium were some of the addictive stimulants that consumers demanded everywhere. The main British contribution to this trade was to produce opium in a cheap and purified form on plantations in their newly conquered colony of Bengal. Later, they extended production to Patna and Benares upstream on the Ganges. Patna and Benares opium became the most popular brands of this major export commodity and a mainstay of the East India Company's rule. Although some opium entered China by land routes from India to Sichuan in the southwest, most of the drugs came by sea and were uploaded in the Linton Rendezvous near Canton. From there, smugglers in their fast crabs did not merely transport the opium to ports along the coast, but also carried it by river into the interior. It was this ever-expanding corruption of a vast portion of the country that provoked Commissioner Lin's alarm and righteous indignation. The prelude to the first of these now celebrated acts took place in March 1839. When Lin, newly arrived in Canton, demanded that the British surrender their opium stocks, he then proceeded to reinforce this demand on dramatic ways. Two leading Hong merchants, Haukua and Maukua, were arrested and threatened this decapitation. Trade in Canton was ordered stopped. Chinese servants and assistants were withdrawn from the foreign factories, and some 350 foreigners were essentially consigned to tedious, uncomfortable detention for what amounted to 6 weeks. In these circumstances, the chief superintendent of British trade in China, Captain Charles Elliot, took responsibility for the opium and in mid-May surrendered 21,306 chests to Lin. Beginning in early June, the opium was destroyed in flamboyant public spectacle. Lin's apparent triumph of June 1839 turned out to be a delusion, for the British seized on the destruction of the opium to demand retaliation and redress. Debate in Parliament was heated and protracted. Hawks called for war against the obstructionist empire that refused to recognize the blessings of free trade. Those essentially agreeing with the Chinese countered that the opium trade was immoral and a stain on Britain's reputation. When William Gladstone, the leading Tory politician, argued that opium was a pernicious commodity and hostilities against China would be unjust and cover this country with permanent disgrace. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, replied that China itself had created the demand for opium and its people were merely disposed to buy what other people were disposed to sell them. At the same time, however, Palmerston himself had reservations about the illicit trade and even more pressing concerns about the practical consequences of committing forces to China. Indian troops were already preoccupied with Russian threats to Afghanistan, while the Royal Navy was concerned about guarding the eastern Mediterranean against Ottoman threats. Tensions increased in July when six drunken British seamen on shore live in Kowloon, located near Hong Kong and across from Macau at the mouth of Canton estuary, vandalized a temple and killed a local man in a brawl. When the British refused to hand over anyone for trial under Chinese justice, arguing that Chinese would use torture to force confessions. Hostilities. The ensuing hostilities lasted for about 3 years, went through several fairly distinct military phases, introduced gunboat diplomacy to Asia in raw and undiluted form, and ended in August 1842 with the first of the unequal treaties that England and the other Western powers expanded on and maintained vis-a-vis China until World War II, almost exactly a century later. So the British graphics themselves, moreover, have many limitations. In these years before photography or the telegraph, communication in general was slow and cumbersome. Sketches and paintings done on the scene by Western observers reached audiences back home in the form of engravings or lithographs long after the events portrayed had taken place. Original artist on the one hand, and the final artist, engraver, and the printer on the other hand, were often continents apart and months or even several years apart as well. Timely reportage, including visual representation, lay decades in the future. As in all imperialist conflict in this age of disproportionate military power, moreover, casualties on the Chinese side were vastly greater than those suffered by the British forces. More than a few battles amounted to massacres. A report submitted a report submitted to the British government in 1847 put total United Kingdom combat casualties in the First Opium War at 69 killed and 451 wounded. For example, while estimating Chinese casualties, including deaths at 18,000 to 20,000, while the popular Western war illustrations convey disparity of power, they only hint at the grim calculus of death that came with this. With the fall of Chinkiang, the way to Nanking now lay open. By early August, the British forces were within firming range of the celebrated walls of the great city, and Qing officials finally realized the foreigners were in position to cut off all vital commerce between South China and the north. Yangtze region was like a throat at which the whole situation of the country is determined. Ilibu, the viceroy of Nanking, observed the enemy, he went on, had already cut off the transportation of salt and grain and impeded the movements of merchants and travelers. This is not a disease like the ringworm, he continued, carried away by his anatomical metaphors, but a trouble in our heart and stomach. The first unequal treaty. Under the Treaty of Nanking, signed on August 29, 1842, China agreed to open the 5 ports requested: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo, and Shanghai, pay an indemnity of 20 million and silver dollars, abolish the Kohong monopoly that hitherto had controlled trade in and through Canton, and adhere to a fixed schedule of custom duties. Additionally, the British were granted the right to occupy Hong Kong in perpetuity. This was their sole outright territorial acquisition. From these up-promising beginnings, Hong Kong, but these up-promising beginnings, Hong Kong rose to become the dominant commercial city in China. Despite such minor complaints, the Opium War was widely regarded in England as a great triumph both for the nation and for Western notions of commercial and technological progress more generally. A good sense of this is conveyed in the gold medal the government struck commemorating the triumph of the British arms 1842. In 1844, United States and France rode in on England's triumph to negotiate their own treaties with the Qing government, effectively internationalizing and consolidating the basis of what became known as the unequal treaty system. These treaties, together with England, began the inexorable process of pressuring China to allow foreigners, including missionaries, traders, doctors, travelers, to move into the interior. Three treaty provisions in particular constituted the core of this inequitable system: extraterritoriality, exemption of the foreigners from Chinese law, most favored nation privileges, and the legal basis for imposing what turned out to be a generally low fixed tariff on China. There were, of course, no commemorative medals or official celebrations on the Chinese side. On the contrary, in the words of historian Emmanuel C.Y. Su, the Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking introduced a century of humiliation for the Chinese people. The war and the 1842 treaty that ended it also, as it turned out, left unresolved the fundamental issue that had triggered hostilities in the first place. Apart from stipulating that of the huge indemnity China agreed to pay, one part, 6 million silver dollars, was compensation for the opium commissioner. Lin had destroyed the opium trade itself, went unmentioned. Thank you.